Last time we spoke about the beginning of the Russo-Chinese War of 1900. Though it's been only referred to as the Russian invasion of Manchuria during the Boxer Rebellion, this event was far larger and more impactful than it seems. The recent Russian acquisitions after the Triple Intervention brought numerous railway workers and guards into the Manchu homelands. It was a joint venture between the Qing and the Russian empires, but the year of 1900 brought the Boxer movement into the mix. The Russians were isolated in various pockets throughout Manchuria. They were being attacked by Boxers and Manchus, who likewise shared their anti-foreign sentiment. Violence broke out in places like Huxingyucheng, Beitaozu, Liaoyang, and Haicheng, seeing Russian forces fleeing one to the next, trying to consolidate for protection. The Russians have received a pretty bloody nose, but they were just about to punch back. This episode is the Russo-Chinese War Part 2, the Blenin Massacre on the Amur River. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I've just released an episode on France during the Pacific War in both English and French. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for exclusive podcasts. The Russo-Chinese War is a bit more difficult to talk about in a chronological order, as so much is going on in different places at roughly the same time. It differed from the conflict going on in China proper, also in the fact it was very much bilateral rather than international. However, there were exceptions seen in places like Yinko. Yinko was a treaty port on the Liaodong Gulf and had an international settlement. Foreign consulates and missions were present there. Yinko was going to be connected to the South Manchurian Railway line and would experience Boxer agitation quite early on. Boxers began plastering the city with anti-Christian placards, proclamations, and youth were of course practicing martial arts in her streets. Then adult Boxers began pouring into Manchuria, where they gradually harassed Westerners. It did not happen overnight. It was a gradual thing. But soon Boxers were fortifying positions everywhere. In June of 1900, Vice Admiral Alexiev telegraphed the Russian Minister of War from Yinko, indicating he required more guards. The Minister of War forwarded the telegram to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, with a recommendation the Admiral should be given authority to take whatever measures necessary to prevent the outbreak of hostilities near Russian-held railway territory. The foreign minister, Count Mikhail Medvedev, agreed and recommended Russian forces should not go far beyond the Guangdong region in their efforts. Tsar Nicholas II also added comments. "It is extremely important for us not to scatter our forces." When Tientsin saw an outbreak of violence and the railway lines in Manchuria were being attacked, Colonel Dombrowski was sent to Port Arthur to Tashichao with the 11th East Siberian Rifle Regiment, a battery, and a sotnia of Cossacks. Colonel Korozenko followed this up with his detachment from Port Arthur, coming via train to Tashichao, while the 7th and East Siberian Rifle Regiments proceeded to Yinko and Tashichao via sea transport. Because Yinko was a treaty port, Russian gunboats were on hand when the violence erupted. When Qing forces began to mass up around Yinko, a bit due north of it, the Russians sent an envoy to meet with the local general, Shu, to inform him Russian gunboats would level the city to the ground should the Chinese attack the Russian settlement. General Shu was livid at this, but kept everything at bay until August the 4th. By that point in time, Russian consul Andrei Timchenko Ostrovenkov had asked Colonel Mishenka and General Fleischer, who arrived on July the 29th, not to disrupt the peace with any military actions. Meanwhile, General Qin Cheng, the commander of Qing forces in the province of Fangtian, decided to counteract the Russian occupations of key points in the Liaodong Peninsula. He deployed large numbers of troops to Yingkou and Anshan while retaining a reserve at Xiaohuozi. General Qin Cheng also sent a request to Beijing to release 20 battalions to the Liaodong Gulf to operate behind the Russian lines and smash the railway lines. Smaller detachments would fight delaying actions while gradually pulling back to Yingkou. The Qing's plan was to lure the Russians over to Anshan, then overwhelm them with superior numbers from three directions coming from Yingkou, Xiaohuozi, and Qianshan Mountains. The detachments coming from Yingkou and Beijing would cut off the escape routes. But before this, the Qing were more or less uncoordinated and not very effective in their military actions. However, now with larger forces at hand, about 50,000 men each, with 60 or so artillery pieces under the command of a commander-in-chief, they were certainly a bit more threatening. Now, while this large maneuver was being prepared, a smaller battle took place at Yingkou on July the 26th. Mishenka, now at Yingkou, received reports that Konozukov had pushed out many Qing forces away from Hushin Yucheng, and now those said forces were en route to Yingkou. Mishenka elected to go out and meet them head-on with 2.5 companies alongside 2 artillery pieces. His forces advanced northeast of the city walls and proclaimed the Qing there had 1 hour to remove their forces from said walls. The Qing defenders, armed with Mauser rifles, fired off in defiance, and soon messengers from incoming Qing forces began galloping towards the city. 50 minutes before an hour had passed, the Russians began deploying themselves to fight. Konstantin and Mamonov led their companies towards the northern and eastern forces. Tryotsky and Propipienka, with their 7 Siberian companies, guarded the right flank in case Qing came from the city. When the ultimatum expired, the Russians began to open fire, met equally back by Qing fire. Within 15 minutes, the Russians had battered the walls with their artillery, and they were scaling said walls. The Qing fired back while making an evacuation of the city. 2 Cossack squadrons with sabers in hand pursued the fleeing Qing. The Russians gradually advanced against the city, then suddenly a special message arrived from the consul demanding they halt the attack. The fleeing Qing forces from Hushin Yucheng, whom Mishenka was trying to cut off from Yingkou, had found out about their attack, and they were now scattering amongst neighboring towns. Mishenka's actions seemed to have worked. Mishenka's forces would have sporadically raised up similar actions against the hostile elements within Yingkou, seeing countless Boxers and sympathizers flee the city. This peaked one day, seeing a small battle before the Russians finally stormed the city, now greatly depleted of its warriors. The Russians captured the arsenal and military stores. They left a half company to guard the entrance to the city. On August the 5th, Vice Admiral Evgeny Alexiev arrived at Yingkou on the cruiser Zebakia. Alexiev was 55 years old at the time, a short, stocky man with a rather large head and a hooked nose. His large beard was beginning to gray, but the man was full of energy and he demanded swift action from his men. He issued a speech on August the 6th. The hostile behavior of the Chinese authorities, who had first encouraged the rebellion and then declared that they could not maintain order, ended in an open attack on our forces placed in the city and in accordance to the wish of the consular body. During the said attack, the Chinese authorities have fled, leaving the town to its fate. To avoid disorder and looting by the Chinese, and with the object of protecting the commerce of the port and the property of foreigners, the Russian military authority found it necessary to place the town under the guard of Imperial Russian troops. Foreign consuls began to request Alexiev send for more reinforcements, stating if he did not do so, they would have to ask the Japanese. The British were not very keen on the Russian occupation, and when the Russians attempted placing their flags over British-owned establishments, it got pretty heated. But the foreigners did feel more at ease with Russian forces guarding the international settlement. For now, it seemed peaceful. Over on the western side of the Amur River, at its juncture, is a place called Blagoveshchensk. It was founded in 1856 as a military post originally named Uskziesk. In 1858, because of its strategic location and economic value, it became the military, civil, and judicial center of the newly formed Amur province. It also held a seat for a military governor. It was renamed Blagoveshchensk, meaning Good News Place, and its first governor, General Nikolai Muriev-Emersky announced its annexation in 1858. Soon some Cossacks moved in to form a local village called Verkhe Blagovenshinsk, Upper Blagovenshinsk. The city grew quickly. By 1900, she had nearly 38,000 inhabitants, with over 3,700 houses. An American traveler described the city as such: as fine for its leading banks and stores as Portland, Maine, or Oregon could show, or any smaller city of the Union. The city had schools, libraries, a theater, and a telephone service. Now, the Amur River formed the boundary between the Qing dynasty and the Russian Empire, going for hundreds of miles or so. To the east opposite of Blagovenshinsk was the Manchu city of Sakhalin. Sakhalin had opened up to foreign trade in 1858 when there was a Manchurian gold rush, and in the 1880s her population boomed to 50,000. Both cities freely went back and forth by boats, and junks, and over the ice during the wintertime to trade. In May of 1900, reports of unrest in China reached Blagovenshinsk, but this aroused little concern. It sounded to everyone like the common troubles of any given year. The people of Manchuria resented foreign activity in their heartland, and they were eager for the Russians to withdraw. But for decades, relations between the Russians and the Chinese were pretty good. To be honest, they were friendly, certainly more so than with other Western powers. The residents of Blagovenshinsk failed to see the signs of the looming conflict. On July the 8th, Chinese living within Blagovenshinsk suddenly began crossing the Amur River with all of their belongings. By late May, some Russians went to trade for cattle in Sakhalin, and they reported sighting 7,000 troops in the mountains beyond Sakhalin. The activity was dismissed as routine maneuvers. On June the 24th, word was received that the Eight-Nation Alliance just seized the Taku forts. That same day, posters emerged in Blagovenshinsk about mobilizing the Priamur region. Reservists began pouring into the city from neighboring towns, and ships were carrying men up the Zaya River. The city's residents thought everything was ridiculous. How could China resist so many powers? Was this all necessary? A resident of Blagovenshinsk, A.V. Kirchner, wrote this of the situation: so accustomed had everyone become to looting on China, and the Chinese were in utter disdain, and so familiar had their cowardice become to all inhabitants along the border, that there was hardly anyone who expected a serious war with China. The Russian reservists were pretty angry about the situation. They had been pulled away from their work, their families, now with nothing but bottles of vodka to drown their sorrows. Many cursed the Chinese for driving wages down in the region, and this led to violence on the Russian side. Angry Russians would frequently harass neighboring villages, causing many Chinese to flee across the Amur River. On June the 28th, telegrams came to Blagovenshinsk conveying the Russian government's declaration made on the 24th that there was no war with China. The troops that took Daku and Tianjin were merely helping the Qing government crush the insurgents who were destroying railroads. This created more confusion for the people in the Amur region. The governor feared things might get out of hand, so he closed down bars and warned residents not to spread false rumors or cause any panic, and above all else, not to molest the Chinese inhabitants. Anyone who did so would be punished. The military began preparing measures to stop internal disorder, to quell possible bandit raids. Cossacks were dispatched out to protect telegraph lines, and patrols were sent to thwart banditry. Chinese and Russian homes began to be robbed, or at least rumors suggested as such, and the different nationalities became suspicious of another. Newspapers began spreading messages to thwart the violence, asking the Russian population to have a sober view of things. News came of von Ketteler's murder on July the 12th, and of the outbreak of hostility at Harbin and along numerous railway lines in Manchuria. However, the people of Blagovenshinsk simply believed all this hostility was confined to the area of Beijing, and perhaps the interior of Manchuria. Certainly, it would not reach them in such a remote place. On July the 14th, a private steamer, the Michael, en route to Khabarovsk to Blagovenshinsk, alongside 5 barges, passed by the Qing village of Aigwen, when Qing officials signaled them to dock. The Russians failed to understand what they wanted and just kept going. The Qing opened fire on the Michael until it stopped, Then they came aboard and saw the cargo was all military supplies. Thus they placed the crew under arrest. A few hours later, the Russian steamer Selenga was going downstream and came over to investigate the Michael. The Qing officials on the shore screamed at the vessel, and her commander, Colonel Schmidt, could see there were Qing troops setting up on the shore. He quickly ordered his men to go full steam ahead, but when they did, the Qing opened fire. The colonel, 4 Cossacks, and 2 sailors were severely wounded in the mayhem. Karl Schmidt rushed to Blagovenchensk with his battered ship. News of the conflict raised an alarm that this was a premeditated act of war. The arrested men of the Michael were let go, and they returned bearing a message from the district chief of Aguen, stating he had acted on the orders of the military governor of Tsitsehar not to let any ship pass. That same night, 2 companies of the 2nd East Siberian Line Battalion, 6 artillery pieces, and the Amur Cossack Regiment crossed the Zaya River, taking up defensive positions. The next day, Blagovenchensk organized a volunteer defense force. On July the 15th, everything seemed quite calm. Some Manchu came over to Blagovenchensk and calmly asked to fetch some of their belongings. A steam cutter patrolled the Amur River, and police searched any Chinese who came over. The reservists were at ease, many cooped up in their barracks. Then suddenly the Qing began firing from across the river, catching the Russians by complete surprise. Panic ensued. Residents fled the Amur River area, pursued by Qing bullets. Rumors spread the Manchu were landing on their side of the river. Countless turned to defend their homes. Women and children surged out of the area. When volunteer fighters found Chinese trying to get across the river away from Blagovenchensk, they immediately attacked them, all having heard of the rumors Chinese had landed ashore on their side. Chinese tossed grenades in the streets, wounding many innocent civilians. By 9 p.m., the Qing guns finally went silent as volunteers dug trenches along the waterfront. Steamers Michael and Selenga proceeded up the Amur and saw Chinese forces building ramparts along the river bank. On July the 16th, the Qing opened fire again, this time on a larger scale. Men were now in foxholes. Police were running through the streets looking for any Chinese. Boxer posters were discovered in the Chinese quarter of the city. Allegedly, these posters stated that the Manchu had landed ashore and for all the Chinese in the city to raise up arms against the Russians. The police began rounding up any Chinese they found, aided by volunteers. Many Chinese were beaten up. All weapons were confiscated. Wild rumors were rampant amongst the residents. At 5 p.m., a force was seen on the horizon. Many thought it was Manchu coming to kill them all. It turned out to be more Chinese being herded away from local villages by Cossack guards. All of the Chinese were being kept at the police station, but now the numbers were swelling to several thousand. There was simply no room for the mass of people at the police station, so many were moved to a lumber mill along the Zaya River. They were left under the guard of 80 recruits armed with just axes. The night was quiet. None tried to escape. The next day, the first group of Chinese, around 3,500, were moved to Verkhenblagovenchensk station for deportation across the river. They were escorted by a small force, marching 6 miles during a particularly hot day. Many of the old and sick collapsed, and some police officers ordered them axed to death. Several were killed. Evidence later would show countless were also robbed. A number of local armed Cossacks rode out to meet the caravan and to help convoy them across the river. But there were no boats, not even sampans, at the shore that they were brought to. Some Russians argued they could not send the Chinese back, as there was a siege-like situation going on. They argued they could not provide the guards necessary to hold down 3,000 Chinese in the city. 10 years after this controversial event, that has been still argued about to this very day, a Russian journal called Vestnik Evropy tried to tell the story of what happened based on gathered evidence and testimony of locals. This is what the article had to say. Nevertheless, the point of crossing was the width of the river at this place, and that was over 700 feet, while the depth reached 14 feet. The current was very strong here, and furthermore, a considerable wind was blowing. Having chosen the place, it was decided that this was enough, and nothing further was needed for the crossing. The Chinese were simply driven into the water and ordered to swim. Part of those in front went into the water. Some swam, but soon began to drown. The remainder did not dare go into the water. Then the Cossacks began to urge them with nagakas, those being whips, and all who had rifles, Cossacks, settlers, old men and children began opening fire. The shooting lasted about half an hour, after which a considerable number of Chinese corpses piled up on the shore. Then after the shooting, the commander of the detachment decided to resort to ordinary arms as well. The Cossacks chopped with their sabers while the recruits were ordered to kill the disobedient Chinese with their axes. When some of the recruits lacked fortitude for this, the Cossacks threatened to decapitate them as traitors. The Chinese cried. Some crossed themselves with the Orthodox cross, pleading that they not be killed, but nothing helped. Before the completion of the crossing, a mounted party of Cossacks from the Amur Cossack regiments also participated in the shooting of the Chinese. The commander of the mounted party at first had not wanted to fire, but upon the demand of the police chief, ordered his men to fire 5 rounds each, and then continued on his way, in spite of the request of Ataman, the commander of the Cossacks who came out to meet the caravan, to remain with his detachment and shoot a while longer, as the Cossacks of the settlement had run out of ammunition. He agreed only to take a note from the Cossack commander to the squadron commander about sending of help. But this request remained unfulfilled. During the crossing of the first party of Chinese, it was found the majority had perished. Some had drowned, others had been slain. Not more than 100 Chinese had swum to the other shore and saved themselves. The article goes on to state the crossing was more of an extermination. Many recruits testified during the investigation after that orders were to drown the Chinese. The massacre did not seem to satisfy the Russians involved, for on July the 19th and the 21st, 2 more parties were sent to the crossing of 170 and 66 Chinese. They were killed in a similar fashion. All of this was overseen by the chief of police. Some Chinese swam to safety, but not very many. The people who butchered the Chinese did not hide their actions either, though their superiors sent reports that most of the Chinese had swam to the other side, and only a few were killed for disobedience. The military governor of the Amur region demanded an inquiry be made, but he did not self-report the matter to the governor-general after the investigation showcased the horror. General Griske was indicted for the crime. He argued in his defense that he acted in accordance with preserving the peace and that he left the matter to the chief of police. He had taken no interest in the details of what occurred during the deportation operation. The chief of police accused the colonel chairman of the Amur military government for being responsible for the massacre. There was an investigation looking into the atrocities committed elsewhere in the Amur region. It was found at the village of Boryevkovkaya, 85 Chinese, including a Qing colonel, were arrested, and the chief of police at Blagovinshinsk telegraphed the police over there. Send Chinese river or annihilate if they resist. When the police replied whether they were to drown the Chinese or just let them cross the river, the chief replied on July the 20th, "One must be crazy and foolish to ask what to do with the Chinese. When one is told to do away with them, one should do without deliberation. The Chinese colonel is not to be kept in a separate place, but in a cell on the same level as the others. Everything in his possession should be taken away. All my orders are to be executed without any evasion. Do not act willfully or bother me with nonsense." The chief of police would also send a circular telegram out to his subordinates stating, "Annihilate Chinese appearing on our side without asking for instructions." The police force at the village testified they provided boats to the Chinese, but that the Cossacks who were providing escort had fired upon them and killed most of them. At the village of Albaninskaya, it was reported that 100 Chinese were peacefully boated across the river when they saw the telegrams. At the village of Pokrovka, the local forces asked for the confirmation of the telegram orders from General Krivsky, who ordered on July the 20th, that it be impressed on the local Russian authorities that Russia's struggle was with armed Chinese, who were engaged in hostilities against them. Peaceful, harmless Chinese, particularly unarmed ones, are not to be harmed in any way. To save their lives, they are to be sent to their side on boats or steamers. Upon hearing this, the chief of police of Blagovenchinsk suddenly reversed his telegram orders, and he now stated that peaceful Chinese must be left unmolested. In the end, the investigation found no real steps were taken by the Russian government to punish the guilty. General Grybski was relieved of his duties, but in consideration of his otherwise perfect record, he was not dismissed from the service. The chief of police was dismissed from his position, and other culprits, for ordering the atrocities, they were discharged dishonorably. But all subordinates who performed the murders were freed of the responsibility. In the public eyes, Grybski and the others were disgraced. The topic of the massacre on the Amur was one the Russians would continue, to this very day actually, to avoid. Not all the villages in the region treated the Manchu poorly. At Desalhinda, Markova, and Ignashina, where boats were available, they safely moved the Chinese across. At Tetstenkaya station, Chinese residents were not molested. But certainly at Blagovenchinsk, it saw the very worst of the horrors. The gunfire across the Amur gradually ceased. The Russian population on their side of the border were relieved. Many of the Chinese had crossed to the other side. The Russian residents of Blagovenchinsk began returning to their homes. However, the lull was a deception. During the night, thousands of Chinese crossed the Amur River between Auguen and the military post No. 1 near the mouth of the Zaya River. They got over undetected, and they were within 1,400 feet of the military post, guarded by just a handful of soldiers with some militiamen, around 400 men strong in all. At dawn on July the 18th, the Chinese opened fire at the militiamen. The men of the military post fired back, but made a withdrawal back over to Blagovenchinsk. The Chinese followed quickly towards a part of the Zaya River. Fortunately for the fleeing Russians, a steamer was coming by at that time. It was carrying a large number of Cossack troops who immediately landed and began to face off against the Chinese. One of the Chinese detachments tried to flee across the Amur and got wiped out. Rumors spread in Blagovenchinsk that the Manchu were trying to get around the city from its rear, and this caused a panic. The situation was critical. The few military troops in the area were moving back and forth between Blagovenchinsk and Auguen, exhausting themselves. If the Chinese had seriously tried to invade, they would have easily overwhelmed the Russian settlements, but they didn't. It could perhaps be due to simple fear or poor strategy, but the Chinese never took advantage of the situation. Russian artillery, vastly outnumbered, tried to reply to the Qing artillery. One night when the Chinese fire was slack, 150 Russians crossed the Amur to prod the Chinese positions, leading to a minor skirmish. On July the 19th, the Chinese tried to cross the Amur in two places, but they were repelled. The Qing gunfire continued to pound Blagovenchinsk and harass the Russian forces, who were slowly being reinforced by men coming over from Khabarovsk. The Russians were gradually crossing the Amur River to harass and seize the Qing-held outposts. Between July the 19th and the 21st, many smaller Chinese settlements on the Russian side of the Amur, beyond the Zaya River, were plundered and destroyed. On the 22nd, the Sangari made its way to the city, dropping off large quantities of ammunition and guns from Khabarovsk. 380 rifles were brought via horseback from Bayekova, and 700 new recruits were landed by the steamer Chikoy. The bombardment of Blagovenchinsk continued sporadically, but the Chinese were losing morale and desertions were increasing. On the 27th, the steamer Selenga performed a reconnaissance of enemy fortifications at Sakhalin, as the Chinese fired wildly upon it. Selenga bombarded the enemy entrenchments, and on the night of the 29th, landed a detachment of Cossacks. General Grybski estimated the Chinese had around 18,000 men and 45 pieces of artillery in the Auguen-Blagovenchinsk region. By the end of the month, the Chinese opportunity to take the city had long passed. Now the Russians were pouring their troops between Auguen and Blagovenchinsk, pressing the war upon the Chinese side. The Russians planned to attack Sakhalin and Auguen on the night of August the 1st. In overall command was Major General Subotich and Captain Zapolsky. The plan called for Colonel Pichonkin and Lieutenant Colonel Ladezhinsky to take the 4th and 5th Sotnyas of the Amur Cossack Regiment and the 1st Sotnya of the Nerchinsk Cossack Regiment over the Amur just above Verkhin-Blagovenchinsk. They would perform reconnaissance and take up an assembly position on the right flank. Colonel Freeman, with 4 companies of the 2nd East Siberian Line Battery, 8 guns of the 2nd East Siberian Artillery Brigade, and half a sotnia of Amur Cossack Regiment, would go across from Verkhovno-Volynsky. Freeman would be followed up by Colonel Schwerin, with 3 companies of the Chita Reserve Regiment, 3 companies of the Sretyensk Reserve Regiment, 8 guns of the 1st Battalion of the Transbaikal Artillery Division, and half a sotnia of Amur Cossack Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Polyakov would cross with the Composite Reserve Battalion of 5 companies. The steamer Alguin and the barge California, alongside 52 smaller vessels, would convoy the troops. The Chinese artillery fired upon the steamers Selenga, Grazdianin, Michael, and Songari, who were going up and down the Amur trying to deflect enemy attention from the invasion. The Chinese expected a landing near the number 1 military post and placed their units accordingly. However, where the Russians would actually land had a very small number of Chinese defenders. The Russians encountered very little resistance landing, and by the time the Chinese advanced to the landing site from the direction of Sakhalin, the Russians had already occupied strategic positions. The Russians bombarded the coastal entrenchments from the flank, driving the Chinese to abandon them. By 7:30 a.m., the Russians advanced against the incoming Chinese. At first, the Chinese were withdrawing orderly, continuing to fire back. But by noon, they began to rout, and they fled for the mountains towards the road to Alguin. A major blunder on the side of the Chinese was continuing to use their artillery on the Russian steamers rather than hitting the advancing troops. The Chinese misbelieved the steamers were actually carrying the invasion force, and they were duped by this. Sakhalin would be evacuated without a fight. Cossack raiders would enter the city, putting everything to the torch, leaving just a few buildings standing. By 6 p.m., when the Russian infantry reached Sakhalin, the Manchu town ceased to exist. While Sakhalin was being taken, the military transports and reserve of Major General Alexandrov were ferried across the Amur, and the Chinese were now regrouping at Alguin. The Chinese dug into the mountains, building up fortifications. When the Russians prodded their defenses on August the 3rd, the Chinese fire was heavy upon them. However, when the Chinese tried to follow up their successes, the Russians flanked them, forcing them back into their entrenchments. The Russian Cossack cavalry made a wild charge, followed up with a bayonet charge overrunning the Chinese positions. Most of the Chinese fled south for other mountain spurs in the direction of Tsitsihar. Many of the units were scattered, unable to provide much resistance. Around 200 Chinese were killed in the mountains, while the Russians reported just 5 deaths and 24 wounded. At 2 p.m. on August the 4th, the Russians resumed their offensive against Alguin, expecting a fierce resistance as it was an important commercial town. The main defensive entrenchments between the mountains and Alguin had been taken one by one. For 5 hours, the Russians advanced under Chinese fire, but their losses were quite light. The Chinese attempted a counterattack in the mountains, but they were met with harsh artillery fire, forcing them back by 7 p.m. Once in range, Russian artillery began smashing Alguin. Fultengauer guns were setting the town ablaze, while 400 Chinese infantrymen valiantly fought on the open field to their death to try and stop them. The Chinese were forced to abandon Alguin by the night. The following day, the Russians moved in, fighting house to house against the stubborn town's defenders who did not flee. In Alguin, the Russians seized cannons, machine guns, and ammunition. Meanwhile, Rennenkampf's Cossack pursued the fleeing Chinese from village to village, fighting skirmishes. Between August the 7th to the 9th, Chinese rearguards, roughly 800 men with 300 cavalry, tried to fight the Cossacks off. On August the 10th, the Chinese rallied to make a stand at the Husing Mountains. Rennenkampf's force of around 4.5 sotnias and 2 cavalry guns ran right into 4,000 Chinese infantry and another 4,000 Manchu cavalry supported by 12 guns. The Cossacks galloped beyond the Chinese positions, causing an onslaught that devolved into a struggle for survival. Cossacks slashed wildly as Chinese fired at point-blank range. Artillery blasted the area, causing absolute carnage. The Chinese eventually were dislodged, but Rennenkampf had to wait for reinforcements to do so. It was on August the 16th the Russians stormed the Chinese positions, and on the 17th the Hoseng'an Pass was taken. Rennenkampf received a report that the Chinese fled to Tsitsihar, so he carried on for it. Tsitsihar was the capital of Heilongjiang province, and on August the 20th, Rennenkampf's cavalry approached 45 miles from it when a flag of truce bearer sent by General Shoshan, the Manchu general of the province, proposed an armistice. Rennenkampf rejected the offer, and he pushed forward. On August the 18th, Rennikov took the city with 460 Cossacks, while one of his units secured the fort across the Noni River. The Chinese offered very little resistance. General Shoshan had poisoned himself. Rennikov's forces entered the city on August the 29th, capturing 31 guns. It was an incredible set of victories. From this point, Lieutenant General Grybsky made an official proclamation to the Chinese of Manchuria, telling them that they had started the war by attacking Blagovenchensk, and now the Russians held Auguen and countless towns in the region. Soon they would come to all of their villages, and if they did not shoot at them, no harm would come to them. He said the Russians only wanted to peacefully build railroads and that everyone would be left in peace to tend to their fields as was before. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I've just released an episode on France during the Pacific War in both English and French. Please also check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. The horrible massacre that occurred along the Amur River is a sore spot to this very day between Russia and China. What began as a rather small conflict quickly unfolded into a full-blown Russian invasion of the Manchu homeland.